Many years ago, when I had a bit more spring in my step, I used to attend a local martial arts club, not with any dreams of becoming the next Chuck Norris, mind you, just trying to keep fit. During one session, I got paired with Ricky, a lovely chap, wiry and skinny as a rake, who honestly, he looked like he'd struggled to open a stubborn jar, let alone throw a decent hit. We started sparring, nice and easy, a few light taps, a kick here and there. It was all going smoothly until we got a bit carried away, as you do. Then, out of nowhere, Ricky, who I later learned was a former amateur lightweight boxer, landed a clean shot to my jaw that hit so hard my ancestors flinched. That moment has stuck with me, not just for the souvenir bruise, but for the lesson. Small doesn't mean weak, and underestimating your opponent can leave you flat on your back wondering what just happened. That life lesson, I think, is the perfect lead-in to the Folland Gnat, a tiny jet that, much like Ricky, packed a punch well above its weight. Designed in Britain during the 1950s by a once-in-a-lifetime engineer, this little aircraft began life as an affordable, lightweight fighter for cash-strapped countries, but ended up proving itself as a hot rod trainer and airshow superstar for the RAF. And it was in India where she became a combat legend, earning the title Sabre Slayer, a nickname that still causes the Pakistani Airforce to bristle. Hello, I'm Joe, and welcome to Aviation Republic. And yes, if you're a regular around here, you've probably noticed the voice is a bit different. Alex, who usually does the narration, is currently off working on a brilliant project at the moment, so I thought I'd jump in and give this narration a go. I've wanted to cover this jet for a while, as I don't think the Gnat story has ever had the spotlight it truly deserves. So in this video, we'll pay homage to one of aviation's great underdogs, a tale of clever design, unexpected heroics, and missed opportunities, a fighter born of post-war austerity and one man's relentless ambition, a true David in an age of Goliaths. So as always, grab a brew, open a fresh pack of chocolate digestives, and let's crack on, shall we? To call William Teddy Petter merely an engineer would be like calling Da Vinci a sketch artist. He was in many ways a man ahead of his time. Born into Britain's great aviation boom, a Cambridge graduate with a first-rate analytical and mathematical mind, he was by all accounts an immensely talented and instinctive engineer, an aerodynamicist with a gift for thinking beyond the convention. Petter was also certainly one of the great eccentrics of the British aircraft industry. It was from this brilliant mind that aircraft like the Canberra and ultimately the Gnat would be born. If you wanted to compare Petter, he was, in my opinion, England's answer to Ed Heinemann. Although intensely shy and reserved, he was not one to suffer fools gladly, whether they were colleagues or superiors, something which was both a help and a hindrance throughout his life. Petter also happened to be the son of Sir Ernest Petter, founder and chairman of Westland Aircraft. And despite accusations of nepotism, it was his father who brought him into the company, where he quickly rose through the ranks to a senior position. Even if nepotism had played a role in his rise, it was talent that kept him there. At Westland, he designed technically brilliant aircraft like the Lysander, Welwyn and Welkin, all unconventional and ahead of their time in one way or another. And I'll say it, both the Lysander and Welwyn were, in my opinion, works of genius. Near the war's end, with the first flights to the Gloucester Meteor and the promise of jet engines, Petter wanted Westland to pursue his designs for a twin-engine jet-powered bomber to replace the Mosquito. Westland, however, opted to focus on a single-seat naval fighter, an entirely different direction. After having secured the rights to his jet bomber design, Petter left Westland in 1944 to join English Electric, which had been subcontracting to build Halifax bombers during the war. But they wanted to start developing their own aircraft. However, having no design team of their own, they managed to lure Petter to come over and establish one for them. At English Electric, Petter designed the famous Canberra and had begun early work on the P1, which would eventually become the Lightning. But disagreements with the board over the direction of future fighter designs led to his resignation in 1950 and his move to Folland. I must add that even though Petter wouldn't see the Lightning through to completion and wouldn't be able to claim the Lightning as his creation, it's undisputed that he did contribute to the initial critical stages that led to the development of the first British jet aircraft to achieve Mark II in level flight. Folland Aircraft had been founded by Henry Folland, formerly the technical director of Gloucester Aircraft, who, like Petter, sought an opportunity to pursue his ideas without management hindrance, and therefore in 1937 he took over British Marine Aircraft based in Nimble on the English south coast, renaming it to Folland Aircraft. Fortunately for Folland and later Petter, the onset of World War II put the company in a financially sound position. It had won an extraordinary number of subcontracts to assemble aircraft like the Bristol Beaufort and Blenheim bombers. During this time, it was also tasked with fabricating fuselage sections for other aircraft such as the de Havilland Mosquito, the Vickers Wellington and the Supermarine Spitfire and Seafire. After the war, the company continued this role, remaining busy through subcontracting, building parts for Vampires, Sea Venoms, Hunters and even a Sea Vixen. Folland even won a contract for the Red Dean, an early radar-guided air-to-air missile. Some say the ministry picked Folland for the contract simply because of Petter's reputation, a project which he ultimately passed off to Vickers. Before Henry Folland stepped down and handed over the reins to Petter, he wanted his firm to pursue its own in-house designs, believing that, should the lucrative run of subcontracting work dry up, original designs could provide a certain degree of stability for the company's large workforce. There may also have been a personal motivation, to be remembered for creating aircraft and not just assembling the work of others. In hindsight, this would prove to be a prophetic decision. Although, for the sake of clarity, I have to add that Folland did dip their toe into building their own aircraft during the war, but these efforts came to naught. See Folland Freifel. Whatever the reason, Petter, serving as the company's managing director and king of all he surveyed, was, for the first time in 20 years, free from the constraints of senior management. Together with a war chest full of cash and production facilities at his disposal, he was also no longer reliant on the financial support from the Ministry of Supply. Now he finally had the opportunity to apply the lessons he'd learned from his previous work on the Whirlwind, Canberra and P1 and put those theories to the test. Even though the twin-engine Lightning could outperform any of its contemporaries, this performance came at a cost. It was an exceptionally sophisticated and heavy aircraft with an all-up weight of 46,000 pounds. It could also prove demanding and challenging for RAF ground crews to maintain and keep operational. Petter instead wanted to trade the Lightning's complexity for a simpler, lightweight, agile fighter that could be built cheaply and maintained easily, perfect for nations for which the increasingly advanced types like the Lightning were beyond their financial capabilities. Petter's logic was sound for the time. He put forward the thesis of mass-producing complex fighters didn't make financial sense when taking into account the upfront capital costs and equipment, together with the long lead times to produce the necessary jigs and tooling. He argued that a smaller fighter could be built with just a fraction of the labour and resources needed for the more complex aircraft. I agree. Personally though, I think we should have stopped at the Hawker Sea Fury. By 1951, fears were growing over the Tupolev Tu-4, which could cruise at 311 miles an hour at 36,000 feet. There were concerns that it wouldn't be long before the Soviets replaced the piston engines with jets. With visions of Tu-4s darkening the skies over London, the RAF approached Petter with a proposal for a lightweight interceptor, something that could climb to 35,000 feet in 2.5 minutes but weigh no more than 5,000 pounds. With his team assembled, many of whom had followed him from English Electric, Petter began work on a design that could intercept those high-flying Soviet bombers. In 1952, he submitted a pair of concepts to the Air Ministry. One was for a 6,400-pound interceptor powered by a single Bristol BE-22 Saturn engine. The other was for a ground attack aircraft weighing 8,000 pounds and using a Rolls-Royce Derwent. However, difficulties with engine development at Bristol led to the Saturn being cancelled and Rolls-Royce refused to supply engines to Folland, but this didn't stop Petter from pushing forward with his design work. He decided instead that his prototype would use a relatively low-powered Armstrong-Siddeley Viper 101 engine that produced just 1,600 pounds of thrust, barely enough power to pull the skin off a rice pudding. Besides the difference in roles, both designs were similar and quite conventional, the sort of thing you'd expect a jet fighter to look like, with air intakes on either side, 40-degree swept wings, with a tailplane mounted on top of the fin. The aircraft would be armed with two 30mm Aiden cannons, plus either rockets or a pair of 500-pound bombs. But despite Petter demonstrating the advantages of his creation, the Air Ministry had gone cold on the idea, considering such a low-powered aircraft as unworkable, no doubt having their minds set on the Hawker Hunter. Still undeterred and convinced that the Air Ministry would soon see sense and come round to his way of thinking, Petter returned to the drawing board, making slight modifications to the design, like adopting a shoulder-mounted wing, placing the tailplane lower down and adding larger air intakes. This revised layout, entirely funded from the company's own pockets, was designated FO-139, although some call it the FO-139, or simply Midge, and was conceived as a one-off proof-of-concept demonstrator. The Midge registration G39-1 made her first flight on August 11, 1954, with test pilot squadron leader Teddy Tennant at the stick. Although powered by an engine producing just 1,600 pounds of thrust, the Midge, at a loaded weight of 4,500 pounds, was capable of reaching 604 miles an hour and a ceiling of 40,000 feet. Notably, it could be nudged past Mach 1 in a shallow dive. Quite a feat on such low power, I might even take back that rice pudding remark. She made up what she lacked in power with some interesting features, including ailerons that doubled as flaps, or so-called flaperons, which drooped to 20 degrees when the main gear was extended. The main undercarriage and nosewheel landing gear had covers that doubled as air brakes when deployed, a feature carried over to the Gnat. Also, the Midge had a one-piece canopy hinged over an armoured inner windscreen. After preliminary tests were completed at Boscombe Down and the company test airfield at Gibraltar, the Midge was displayed at the 1954 Farnborough Air Show by Folland in an attempt to interest the Air Ministry, which had by this time given their full support to Hawker and their Hunter. But this didn't mean that other countries might not be interested. The Midge caught the eyes of pilots from India, Canada, Jordan, New Zealand and Yugoslavia at the air show, impressing them and leading to an invitation to test fly the Midge. Even a USAF pilot remarked on how beautifully she handled. Sadly, the little machine met a grim end on September 26, 1955, crashing shortly after takeoff from the company's airfield whilst being flown by Swiss test pilot Major Max Maffez. The investigation into the accident didn't reach any firm conclusion on the cause. However, it was suggested that during the takeoff run, the pilot may have accidentally operated the trim control on the control column for the variable instant tailplane, mistaking it for the radio button he was used to on the Vampires. Unfortunately, Major Maffez did not survive. No fault to the aircraft, just bad luck. And so, despite losing the Midge, she had proven her worth in her short life, flying 220 sorties and logging 109 hours. With her success as proof of concept, Petter now turned his sights to building an actual combat aircraft. An aircraft that would become one of the jet age's most distinctive lightweight fighters. Although the pilots who flew the Midge sang her praises, reporting that she was a lovely aircraft to fly, they did have two complaints: her lack of power and lackluster climb rate. Something had to be done about that weak engine. Fortunately for Petter, over the years he had cultivated a close relationship with the legendary Stanley Hooker, an English mathematician and engineer who had recently moved from Rolls-Royce to Bristol Engines. Stanley Hooker, The humble genius was the man who would one day lead the development of the Bristol Olympus engine that would be fitted to the Avro Vulcan and Concorde, and then the Pegasus engine for the Harrier. Still, back then, he already had a solid reputation, having designed the two-stage supercharger for the Merlin, which hugely transformed its high-altitude performance. Some say one of the few men who can claim to have won Britain the war. At Rolls-Royce, he led the development of the early centrifugal flow jet engines, such as the Derwent and Nene, that powered aircraft like the Gloucester Meteor and Supermarine Attacker. Later, he contributed to developing the axial flow single-spoon Avon engine, but problems with the project ultimately led to his acrimonious departure from Rolls-Royce, ironically a company to which he would return to save it from the brink of disaster in 1971. I highly recommend his book, Not Much of an Engineer. Hooker was aware of the work Petter and his team were doing over at Folland, and he was sure he could design a lightweight but powerful engine able to put out a lot more thrust pound for pound than the Derwent and Avon jets. Hooker and his team at Bristol revived the Saturn engine project, building a small, easy-to-maintain axial-flow turbojet with a 7-stage compressor driven by a single-stage turbine, designated the BE-26 Orpheus. This engine weighed just 800 pounds but produced 3,285 pounds of thrust, and one of the simplest of all modern turbojets, the perfect match for what Petter needed. Like the Midge, the prototype Gnat was small compared to the contemporaries of the day, measuring only 29 feet 8 inches in length and 22 feet 1 inch across its swept wings. The wing area was increased from 125 to 136 square feet. She has always reminded me of a shrunken down Jaguar from the side profile. What do you guys think? Due to the small size of the cockpit, Martin Baker seats were out of the question. So the Gnat was fitted with an ejector seat which Folland had developed with the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich, usable from sea level up to 50,000 feet. Although Petter always tried to keep the ease of maintenance in mind, it wasn't always easy in such a compact design. Some ground crews even claimed that it would have helped to have had arms with half a dozen joints to get into all those hard to reach areas. Even so, the wings were built as a complete structure and could be swapped in hours since they could be detached by removing just 4 bolts. The same consideration was given to the power plant maintenance. The rear fuselage, built from a light alloy thin skin stiffened by pressed frames, could be detached to remove the little Orpheus turbojet. Among the many interesting design choices for the Gnat were the location of its guns. On other aircraft like the Hunter and the Swift, the gases from the guns disrupted the airflow into the engines, sometimes causing flameouts at high altitude. To avoid this, the two 30mm Aiden cannons, the Gnat's primary armament, were cleverly tucked into the outer portions of the air intakes and angled outwards, with a row of 4 vent holes on the outside to prevent the muzzle gas from being sucked into the engine, a thoughtful bit of engineering for a jet that small. Alongside the guns, and keeping with the original F-140 design, the 2 underwing pylons could carry either a pair of drop tanks, 2 500-pound bombs, or unguided rocket pods, but due to the limited range of the Gnat, it almost always flew with the drop tanks. One of the biggest changes from the earlier Midge was the realization that a manual elevator just wasn't up to the task at transonic speeds, even with an electrically powered tailplane helping out. Most conventional fighters solved this by using a fully hydraulic tailplane, but Petter wasn't having it. The added weight didn't fit the Gnat's lightweight design philosophy. Instead, he came up with a clever compromise. He stuck with the manual elevator, not just as a backup, but to give the pilot proper control feedback. A single hydraulic actuator was added linked directly to the elevator. This is what actually moved the tailplane and handled most of the pitch control, and just in case the hydraulics failed, the original electrical system for the tailplane was kept in place, giving the pilot one more layer of backup for emergency landings. If not for Petter's single-mindedness, The Gnat might have seen widespread NATO service across Europe. At the time, the United States Air Force was well aware of the Gnat's development and was actively seeking an affordable, easy-to-maintain lightweight fighter that could be supplied to less industrialized nations like the rebuilt Italy and Germany and operated from dispersed, less vulnerable airfields across the continent. The project, led by Colonel Johnny Driscoll, head of the United States Mutual Weapons Development Program office in Paris, organized a competition for a light tactical strike fighter weighing less than 8,000 pounds and can take off and land in less than 2,000 feet from rough and hastily prepared runways, or what Driscoll called cow pastures. Quite a task, since at the time, most jet fighters needed at least double that distance. In 1954, the competition was launched, and the requirements were precisely what the Gnat was designed for. It seemed like a done deal for Folland, except for one thing. The Gnat was intended to operate from conventional runways, and as such had thin, high-pressure tyres for concrete runways, whereas operating from unprepared strips or grass runways would need low-pressure tyres. Stanley Hooker urged Petter to alter the undercarriage base to fit the larger retracted wheels, adding blisters to accommodate the change, even pleading with him to tell the judges that he would at least try to do it. But Petter refused, adamant he wouldn't even consider the possibility of altering the clean aerodynamic lines of his design. Even when the Air Ministry stepped in to try and convince Petter to make the changes, he stood firm. His design must remain untouched. So it was to be a four-way fight between Dassault, Breguet and Nord from France and Fiat in Italy. It just so happened that no other British firm was interested. The panel of 6 judges, 2 French, 2 Italian, 2 British, ultimately chose the Fiat G91 for NATO's light fighter competition, placing the Gnat in last place, rejected, despite having a 2-year lead on the other contenders, expected to be operational by 1957. Petter's obstinacy in not considering the low-pressure tyres cost him the competition. The G91, of which nearly 800 were built, served with the Italian, German and Portuguese air forces, although the French, claiming shenanigans had the hump that Fiat had won, angrily refused to take the little Italian beauty. But then again, neither did we. Shame, she's such a lovely looking machine. The irony of this story was that the Gnat trainer version got the wider tyres without any blisters, and Hooker's Orpheus 803 engine was chosen to power the G91, with the Americans funding 75% of its development. What's even more ironic was this was the engine that was developed for the Gnat. In the words of Stanley Hooker, the Mutual Weapons Development Program was an act of great generosity by the American people. The first flight of the Gnat prototype, now given the designation FO-141 registration G39-2, was made on July 18, 1955, the same year as the MiG-21, again with Teddy Tennant at the controls. By all accounts, it was an uneventful flight, with Tennant reporting that she handled superbly with a fantastic roll rate of 360 degrees per second. The Gnat F1 was fitted with the Bristol Orpheus 701 turbojet, initially producing 4,500 pounds of thrust, with later variants like the Orpheus 703 boosting that to 4,800 pounds of thrust. When you consider the Gnat weighed only 4,800 pounds empty, it's not surprising that with that amount of thrust she had a maximum speed of 695 miles an hour and a ceiling of 45,000 feet, which could be reached in just 5 minutes and still be shown a climb rate of 4,000 feet per minute. Once at altitude, she could cruise along at 530 miles an hour. That year at Farnborough, the Gnat prototype made her first public appearance, where Tennant showed off the little aircraft making a low-level pass at Mach 0.8 and pulling up to demonstrate her rocket-like climb rate. Whilst flight testing the Gnat, Tennant had a stroke of bad luck and good fortune in equal measure. In September 1956, he was up at 1,000 feet in the Gnat performing aerodynamic tests to examine flutter. This required him to pull back on a stick to induce oscillations and continue to yank back on a control column, with increasing force inducing further oscillations until flutter became apparent. During one of the runs, he pulled back on the stick while travelling at Mach 0.91 when, unknown to Tennant, both halves of the tailplane and the entire elevator had separated. On finding that the aircraft was not responding to stick inputs when he tried to roll the Gnat slightly to line up for landing, he decided he had no option but to eject, despite his speed being way above those for which the ejection seat was cleared for. Despite this, he opted to chance it, so out he went. He made a successful landing near to the farm he'd rented close to the company airfield at Chilbolton, well within walking distance, where his wife, when returning from a shopping trip, found him sitting in his armchair, stiff drink in hand, and asked him, "What are you doing here? I thought you were supposed to be working today." A month after her maiden flight, despite the RAF still showing no interest, even though the little machine would only require 20% of the man-hours to build and 30% of the price of a Hawker Hunter, the Ministry of Supply was instructed to order 6 evaluation aircraft to keep the company motivated. It was hoped that this order might give Folland a chance to explore overseas sales, which was the Gnat's only hope, since by the time of her first flight in 1955, the company had already spent almost £750,000, or £22 million in 2025 money. And they faced an uphill struggle as, without a doubt, it's sort of challenging to sell a fighter that's been rejected by its own Air Force. But Petter took this initial order as a sign that he had finally convinced the men at the ministry and had begun planning for future versions, like the FO-142 Gnat F2, that would have had a thinner wing and powered with the Bristol Orpheus 12 SR afterburning engine that could produce 6,800 pounds of thrust dry, or 8,100 pounds of thrust with a simplified reheat system engaged. With this engine, it was expected to get the Gnat up to Mach 1.28. If the RAF had taken it on, it could have rivaled the Northrop F5 on the international market. Other proposed versions included the FO-143 Gnat F4, essentially an improved F2 fitted with an air intercept radar and able to carry guided weapons. After Hawker Siddeley took over Folland in 1959, one of the designs Petter had been working on caught the eye of Maurice Brennan, who, after Petter had resigned from the company, became the new director and chief engineer of Folland. What he had sketched out before he left was the Mark V, a supersonic single or two-seater aircraft fitted with a Ferranti radar and powered by a pair of Rolls-Royce RB153R engines with reheat and armed with 2 Firestreak missiles. I believe from what I have read that this was at one point considered for carrier operations. Brennan adapted the basic design of the Mark V with a variable geometry wing, with the object of creating a multi-purpose aircraft, of which 2 layouts were envisaged, one tailless and the other one with a tailplane, both given the name FO-147. Measuring 51 feet in length with a wingspan of 36 feet 6 inches, it was estimated that with its twin Rolls-Royce engines, it was expected to reach Mach 2 and intercept targets up to 50,000 feet, 200 nautical miles from base. However, the men at the ministry and the RAF were not interested, not even as trainers for the F-111. Had the FO-147 been put into production, it would have made a great test platform for variable geometry theories, which had only been tested on models up to that time. Interestingly, the Indian government was considering a naval version of the Gnat. However, it turned out that the little aircraft was too light for the INS Vikrant steam catapult, which needed a minimum of £10,000 to operate correctly. However, with the additional engine and radar, I don't see why it wouldn't have met the weight requirement. Fun fact, the Gnat and an Indian Ajeet appeared as carrier aircraft in Hot Shots as the Oscar EW5894 Phallus, a documentary from which I learned the important lesson that crabs work in pairs. Test pilots praised the Gnat's performance and maneuverability, saying that you don't climb into a Gnat, you strap it on, However, ground crew continued to lament, saying that being so small, access to vital parts was somewhat restricted. Still, according to Stanley Hooker, RAF pilots were queuing up to get their hands on the F-1s, who called her an aerodynamic masterpiece, much to the great embarrassment of the Air Ministry. Despite these grand plans and all the favourable reports from those who flew her, Petter was told in no uncertain terms that these 6 aircraft were for development purposes only and wouldn't ever see service with the RAF. And without the deep pockets and piles of cash available to the Americans, the British government wasn't able or willing to fund a Gnat for the export market. No doubt by 1957, Duncan Sandys' white paper cancelling all manner of projects put the idea of the F-1 seeing RAF service to bed once and for all. Here's an interesting story. A while back, I came across an unusual plan to extend Bomber Command's deterrent capability. This involves strapping Gnat fighters, including their pilots, under a Vulcan II bomber, using a hardpoint intended initially for the now cancelled Skybolt missiles. Each of the Gnats would have been fitted with long-range drop tanks and carried a kiloton range nuclear weapon, and would have been released near to the target, but with limited chances of survival after the strike, the idea was ultimately abandoned. I want to take a second here to thank you so much for watching. I'm truly grateful to share my love of aviation with fellow enthusiasts like you, and your support means everything to a small channel like mine. So if you're enjoying this story, please take a quick second to hit the like button. It's a small gesture that makes a huge difference in helping me reach more aviation fans. Now let's get back to the story. With the RAF firmly set on the Hunter, it was clear they wouldn't be a customer, so Petter had no choice but to change course. As fighters got faster and more complex, he foresaw a growing need for an advanced trainer to replace the Vampire T-11 and Jet Provost. The Air Ministry was of the same mind and asked Petter to develop a tandem seat advanced trainer based on the Gnat. After extensive design work, the FO-144 Gnat T-1 received official approval in January 1958, which led to a pre-production order from the Ministry of Supply for 14 development aircraft under specification T-185D. The contract laid out several performance benchmarks that the trainer had to meet. For example, it had to reach 40,000 feet in 7 minutes, hit a top speed of Mach 0.96, take off in just 1,600 feet, and land in 3,900. This trainer would have very similar performance to the Gnat fighter, an absolute rocket ship, and it was to be Petter's final design project to go into operational production. Naturally, the fuselage had to be lengthened to accommodate the tandem seat layout. To maintain the correct center of gravity, the Orpheus engine was moved further aft, and equipment behind the pilot's seat, including a 20-gallon fuel tank, was removed. The addition of the second seat ultimately extended the fuselage by 12 inches. This was more than originally intended. Petter had only wanted a 9-inch extension, but this would have made the cockpit far too cramped for taller pilots, and it was a tight fit. And those that couldn't squeeze themselves into the Gnat missed out entirely and were instead directed to its roomier rival, the Hunter. In theory, they also worked to improve access to internal components compared to the fighter version. The idea was that major parts could be swapped out more easily, but in practice, RAF ground crews had a slightly different opinion. It also turned out that approach speeds would be a little bit on the high side for a trainer, so a larger wing was added. The new wing had a span of 24 feet and an area of 175 square feet. To offset the added drag, the thickness to chord ratio was trimmed from 8 to 7%. The wings were further reworked with outboard ailerons and inboard flaps, which increased lift and further lowered approach speeds, especially helpful for instrument flying. The redesigned wings brought more than just better handling, they also made room for additional internal fuel. Tanks were built into the leading edges, giving the Gnat around 75 minutes of flight time for extended dual instruction. With external tanks, that could be stretched to as much as 150 minutes. But rather than using conventional drop tanks, which could affect performance and stability, the Gnat was fitted with slipper tanks flush mounted under the wings. These provided extra range without compromising the aircraft's aerodynamic profile. Other mods were in the simplicity of arming the Gnat's ejection seats. No pins to drop here, just a big red knob on the stick. If the pilot forgot to arm the seat, they would be poked in the back of the neck when they tried to sit back. All they had to do to arm the seat was to turn the stick through 90 degrees. Because the Gnat also had to teach basic weapons delivery, the underwing pylons were set up to carry a variety of weapons, ranging from 2 500-pound bombs, rocket pods, sidewinders, bullpups, or a pair of cannon pods. The first Gnat T1 took to the skies on August 31st, 1959, flying from Chilbolton, just in time to meet the contract deadline that required that the aircraft fly before the end of the month. A week later, it made its first public appearance at the Farnborough Air Show. By then, Folland had been swallowed up by Hawker Siddeley, with production moving to Dunsfold around 60 miles away from Chilbolton. Powered by the Orpheus 100 or 101 engine, it had enough thrust to go supersonic in a shallow dive and reach 45,000 feet in 12 minutes, compared to the 20 minutes of the Hawker Siddeley Hawk, which would eventually replace it. The Gnat T1 entered RAF service in 1962 with No. 4 Flying Training School at RAF Valley, North Wales, replacing those aging Vampire T11s and tasked with training Jet Provost graduates. On the Gnat, they honed their skills in air combat and high-speed navigation, flying up to 725 miles an hour and reaching altitudes of 48,000 feet, though a few pilots managed to push the aircraft up to 52,000 feet. Instructors and student pilots loved the Gnat's ultra-responsive controls and head-banging roll rate. Compared to the older Vampires and docile Provost jets, it was a fun aircraft to fly by a country mile. Plus the cockpit in the Gnat was not the ergonomic slum of the Vampire, although I've heard that the Gnat could be a real handful during crosswind landings. During their time with the RAF, Gnat T1s underwent a comprehensive redesign of the cockpit to incorporate new flight and TACAN navigation instruments. They also received anti-skid brakes, drag parachutes, engine anti-icing, and a failure warning system, bringing pilots closer to what they would experience in frontline jets like the Lightning, Hunter or Vulcan, the types many of its trainees would eventually fly on active duty. Between 1962 and 1965, 167 Gnat T1s were built, until they were replaced by the Hawk as the RAF's advanced jet trainer in 1978. However, pilots were soon disappointed when they discovered the performance of the Hawk to be inferior to that of the twitchy Gnat, probably down to the fact that the Gnat was a fighter adapted to a trainer, whereas the more docile and forgiving Hawk was a purpose-designed trainer. But half a world away, a border war would prove to the stuffy bureaucrats at the ministry that they had missed a great opportunity. Here the Gnat would prove that she was more than just a pretty little thing. How the Gnat came to serve in the Indian Air Force and subsequently achieve almost legendary status as the infamous Sabre Slayer began in 1954. Legend has it that an Indian evaluation team headed by Air Commodore Pratap Chandra Lal was sent to Europe to test fly the French Mystère and the British Swift. Whilst in England, the Indian team had the chance to evaluate the Midge and recommended that it be considered for the Indian Air Force after a chance sighting by Air Commodore Lal. Apparently the story goes that he had noticed a small aircraft being flown near Chilbolton and, impressed by the handling qualities of the Midge, asked if the Indian Air Force team could take a closer look and evaluate it. Whether there's any truth to this is questionable, but it makes for a great anecdote. Regardless if there's any truth to the story, they were sufficiently impressed with the Midge that Folland negotiated a deal in 1956 with India to purchase 40 Gnat F1s powered by the Bristol Orpheus 701 engine. 25 Gnats were to be built in Hamble, with a further 15 to have their wings removed, be crated up and flown in a cargo bay of a C-119 for final assembly by HAL or Hindustan Aircraft. The first Gnat assembled by HAL from a kit took to the air from Bangalore in November 1959, and the first wholly built Gnat made its maiden flight in May 1962, with the Indian aircraft builder manufacturing 195 license-built Gnats by 1974. To expedite the Gnat's introduction to the Indian Air Force, Squadron Leader Surajan Das, an exceptional pilot and a graduate of the Empire Test Pilot School, was dispatched to assist in a test fly-in at Chilbolton. even displaying 2 of the initial 6 Gnat prototypes at the 1957 and 1958 Farnborough air shows. However, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Even though by 1958 the Indian Air Force had established a Gnat handling flight at Kanpur, it was soon discovered that the Indian pilots were experiencing issues with the Gnat. They found it to be an extremely challenging aircraft to handle during the early stages of training because, unlike the RAF, the IAF didn't buy the trainer version. So to compensate for the lack of Gnat trainers, new pilots were recruited from Hawker Hunter squadrons, having gained experience on powered controls. The students were instructed on the Hunter trainer, after which they would climb into the single-seat Gnat, do a few full-throttle runs up the runway before going solo. But the old problems of longitudinal control resurfaced. Pilots found the Gnat overly sensitive, especially during gear retraction when the aircraft had a tendency to pitch up sharply. Nearly all new pilots struggled to manage this sudden change in attitude. These problems were overcome with proper instruction, but there were some issues, such as the guns jamming at the most inopportune times, would plague the Gnat throughout its service. The first Gnat squadron was No. 23 Cheetah, which converted from the de Havilland Vampire on the 18th of March 1960 under the command of squadron leader S. Raghavendran. This was followed in early 1962 by No. 2 Squadron and the following year by No. 9 Squadron, all based at Ambala. By the time the Second Indo-Pakistani War of 1965 erupted, India had 5 Gnat squadrons in service. Apart from the Gnat, they also operated Hunters, Mystères, Vampires and a few MiG-21s. The fighting began in earnest following Pakistan's unsuccessful Operation Gibraltar in August 1965, which was designed to infiltrate forces into Jammu and Kashmir to precipitate an insurgency with trained guerrillas, hoping to foment an uprising against Indian rule and claim the Kashmir region for itself, an area which, thanks to our penchant for drawing arbitrary lines on maps, remains highly disputed to this day. Unfortunately for Pakistan, the Kashmiris had not risen as they had hoped, with the Indian military fighting and capturing the guerrillas throughout the month of August. After the failure of Operation Gibraltar, Pakistani armour crossed into Jammu on the 1st of September in Operation Grand Slam, intent on capturing a strategic bridge. Initially, Pakistan seemed as though it would be successful in holding the crossing, thus cutting off supply routes to Indian troops. India responded by calling in its Air Force to blunt the Pakistani attack, sending in Mystères and Vampires to counter them with air-to-ground attacks. The first formation of 4 Vampires, led by squadron leader Sudesh Kumar Dahar, took off from Pathankot in late afternoon. This was followed by 2 more formations armed with rockets and guns, which took to the air at 10-minute intervals. Although the 2 countries had previously faced off in the First Kashmir War during the late 1940s, that engagement was very limited in scale compared to the 65 conflict. This time, it seemed that the Pakistan Air Force, or PAF, would have the upper hand with their F-86 Sabres, which the Air Force considered to be the best dogfighter in the region. The Vampires attacked the Pakistani armour with rockets and guns, making repeated passes despite the intense ground fire in the fading light and the air threat from the PAF. And it wasn't long before that ground fire hit one of the Vampires flown by Flight Lieutenant Patak. Unfortunately, by 1965, the Vampires were wholly outdated sitting ducks for the Sabres. The second Indian pair was bounced by 2 Sidewinder-armed F-86s flown by Squadron Leader Rafiq and Flight Lieutenant Imtiaz Bhatti. These Sabres stumbled into the battle area just as the second formation of Vampires led by Flight Lieutenant Bagwagar came in for the attack. Even though the best course of action for the Vampire pilots should have been to hit the deck and get out the area as quickly as possible, instead they decided to stay and fight rather than running away. But despite their courage, the Sabres tore into the Vampires and shot them down one by one. Of the 4 Vampires claimed by the Pakistani pilots, Rafiq was credited with 2 of the kills, with Bhatti getting the credit for the other 2, even though it is claimed that AAA shot down one of the Vampires. In the utterly uneven duel, 3 Indian pilots had lost their lives. On September 2nd, 2 MiG-21s and 8 Gnats from No. 23 Squadron relocated to Pathankot, where the pilots were given a brief by the commanding officer who told them, "We want you to shoot down those Sabres. How you do it is your problem, but the Sabres will have to be tackled." Fearing that the enemy might have the upper hand, the pilots needed a plan to tackle the scourge of the F-86 fighters. What they came up with was a ploy to lure the Pakistani pilots into a trap, using their Mysteres as bait, flying at mid-level to ping enemy radar, while 8 Gnats would keep out of radar cover by flying at low level. Once they had detected the incoming PAF fighters, the Gnats would climb up and engage the enemy. The following day, 4 Mysteres, which were effectively museum pieces, took off from Pathankot, flying at 1500 feet along the Pakistani border. Here it was hoped of being detected by enemy radar, which didn't take long. Reports came into the pilots that Indian radar had tracked 6 Sabres and 2 starfighters approaching to intercept the Mysteres. As planned, the Pakistani radar had failed to spot the 2 flights of Gnats, flying at just 300 feet. The first flight of 4 Gnats, led by squadron leader Johnny William Green, pulled up into a steep climb, with the second flight led by squadron leader Trevor Keylor covering their flanks. Soon the Gnats and Sabres would catch sight of each other, where Keylor was able to get behind one of the enemy aircraft, quite a feat considering the Sabres could outturn the Gnat. His cannon fire tore off one of the F-86's wings, causing it to flip over into an uncontrollable dive. The Indian Air Force had claimed its first kill, and the first time the Gnat had fired its guns in anger. However, some reports state that the Sabre, flown by Flight Lieutenant Yusuf Ali Khan, was seen to be hit by the Gnat's cannon. Although reportedly damaged, Khan managed to land his aircraft. This initial encounter was short-lived, as Pakistani F-104s superior to the Gnat in speed joined the fray. Despite this, the Starfighter was a high-level interceptor designed to bring down Soviet bombers rather than engage in dogfights with agile fighters at low altitude, so it was no surprise that whenever challenged by Indian pilots, they usually turned tail, engaged their afterburners and fled the scene. When the Indian pilots landed back at base, they discovered that one of their number, Squadron Leader Sikand, was missing. In the melee of the dogfight, Sikand had suffered a total electrical failure and had become lost over unfamiliar territory. Running low on fuel, not a great position for any pilot to be in, and without any navigational aids apart from maps and knowledge of the local area, he found himself at a disused airfield. Believing to be over India, he landed. Unfortunately for him, he happened to land at a Pakistani airfield of Peshawar, where he was captured and taken prisoner. His aircraft gleefully fallen into enemy hands, which they took for evaluation. Interestingly, some claim that Sikand surrendered after being intercepted by a starfighter, whereas India maintains that he landed at the airfield after getting lost. The captured Gnat is now on display at the PAF Museum in Karachi. However, if the Sabre kill of the previous day was disputed, there would be no ambiguity on September the 4th. Once more, Squadron Leader Green, while leading a flight of 4 Gnats on a mission to escort Mysteres, ran into 4 Sabres over their planned rendezvous point, flying in a circuit and taking it in turns to attack Indian troops in the Sham area. Seeing this, Squadron Leader Green, followed by 3 other Gnats, dove into the Sabres, each Indian pilot latching onto an enemy fighter. Flight Lieutenant Mudeshwar got behind an F-86, but it managed to escape thanks to the Gnat's cannon again jamming. It would be Flight Lieutenant Pathania who would claim the first confirmed Sabre for the IAF, and the first Gnat kill when he managed to shoot down the F-86 flown by Flying Officer N.M. Butt with a few short bursts. Fortunately for Butt, he managed to eject, escape capture, and finally be picked up later by a rescue helicopter to rejoin the fight. On the 14th of September, Gnats pounced the flight of Sabres that were attacking IAF Canberras on a bombing mission. Upon seeing the Gnats, the Sabres broke off their attack, with one being chased by Wing Commander Bharat Singh, a fight that took them down to the deck. Even though the Pakistani pilot was able to dodge Singh's bullets, his evasive maneuvers cost him his life when his aircraft crashed into the ground. In encounters between Sabres and Gnats, the Indian Air Force claimed to have shot down 7 F-86s for the loss of only 3 Gnats. There were some interesting eyebrow-raising claims that one Pakistani pilot, M.M. Alam, managed to shoot down the entire Indian Air Force on his own in a matter of minutes. The story goes that on September 7th, 1965, during a single sortie, he reportedly shot down 5 Indian Air Force Hawker Hunters in under a minute. This was along with his previous claims to have downed 4 aircraft in 30 seconds. Feats that, if confirmed, would be one of the fastest kill streaks in jet combat history. Needless to say, the IAF disputed his claims. For the sake of everyone's sanity, we'll just assume that both sides told the truth whenever they say they shot someone down, because even to this day the actual number of aircraft shot down or destroyed remains highly contentious to say the least. Still, it's clear that the Gnat caught the IAF by surprise during the war, and even more so the Pakistan Air Force, which had initially underestimated it, finding her a tough customer in a dogfight. The Pakistanis had believed the Hunter to be the main threat, mainly because the Gnat had previously caused significant technical difficulties for the Indian Air Force. I don't want to take anything away from the battle-tested Sabre. It was a highly capable machine, and his record against the MiGs in Korea speaks for itself. However, by 1965, the F-86 was a decade-old design. The Gnat, with its much smaller size, gave its pilots the advantage of being harder to spot, and even though they couldn't outturn the Sabre, they could outclimb them, nearly 20,000 feet per minute compared to the Sabre's 9,000. However, this wouldn't be the last time that the Sabres and Gnats would be called upon to fight. As with all prolonged rivalries, India and Pakistan clashed once more in 1971, their third war since independence. But unlike the earlier two, Kashmir wasn't the flashpoint. This time the conflict centered on East Pakistan's fight for independence, now known as the Bangladesh Liberation War. The conflict stemmed from West Pakistan's refusal to honour the 1970 election results, where East Pakistan's Awami League led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman won a majority but was denied power. This led to widespread protests in East Pakistan, which were brutally suppressed by the Pakistani military through Operation Searchlight. This operation caused mass casualties and a refugee crisis with between 8 and 10 million Bengalis fleeing to India. India, burdened by the refugees and motivated by geopolitical interests, supported a Bengali resistance Mukti Bahini with arms and training, all of which provoked Pakistan. At this time, the Indian Air Force had built up the number of Gnat squadrons, 5 of which were based in the western sector. Interestingly, they were by this time the world's 5th largest air force after the USA, the Soviets, China and France, with approximately 625 aircraft organised into 34 fighter and 5 bomber squadrons. One of these, number 22 Squadron, was moved to Dum Dum Airfield near Calcutta for air defence in that area, under Wing Commander Sikand. Although the official war began on December 3, 1971, the Pakistani Air Force had already made some incursions in the Boira sector on the West Bengal-East Pakistan border to attack guerrillas who were operating in the region. On the morning of the 22nd of November, 4 Pakistani Canadair Sabre Mark 6s, operated by No. 14 Squadron, made an incursion into southwestern Bangladesh. These were spotted by Indian radar, and 4 Gnats from Dum Dum were scrambled to intercept these Sabres. But the Sabres, fitted with the more powerful Arenda 14 engine, managed to get away before the Gnats could get to them. However, the Gnat pilots were not to be cheated. That afternoon the Sabres were back, and again they were picked up on Indian radar at 2,000 feet as they headed for Boira. Within minutes of being spotted, 4 Gnats were scrambled from Dum Dum. The first section led by Flight Lieutenant Roy Andrew Massey, with Flight Officer Soares as his number 2. The second section was flown by Flight Lieutenant Ganapathy and Flying Officer Lazarus. It was these two who made first contact with the Pakistani Sabres as they were in the middle of attacking ground targets. They managed to place themselves behind a pair of Sabres as they were pulling out of their attack, which unfortunately for them, they put themselves right in the line of fire of Ganapathy's and Lazarus's cannons. Now seeing their opportunity, the Indian pilots shot down their Sabre each. The 2 Pakistani Air Force pilots, Flight Lieutenant Parvez Mehdi Qureshi and Flight Officer Khalil Ahmed, ejected to safety, only to be captured on landing. Flight Lieutenant Massey managed to hit one of the 2 remaining Sabres flown by Wing Commander Afzal Chowdhury. However, he was unable to finish the job when his starboard cannon jammed, having to be content to watch his prey flee back into East Pakistan airspace, trailing plumes of smoke and fire. Later reports by Pakistani officials stated that although Chowdhury managed to make it home, the aircraft was beyond repair. Conversely, Chowdhury's claim of shooting down a Gnat still remains unsubstantiated due to the absence of wreckage, camera footage or Indian confirmation. The next day, the exploits of the Indian Gnat pilots had made the headlines, and they were, as you can imagine, treated as national heroes, even though the war between India and Pakistan wasn't officially to start for another week, when Pakistan launched a preemptive airstrike on Indian air bases, prompting India to declare war. Although no story of the 1971 air war can be complete without the most famous Gnat pilot, Flying Officer Nirmal Jeet Singh Sikon. On the morning of the 14th of December 1971, a formation of 4 Pakistani Sabres from No. 26 Squadron, operating out of Peshawar, launched an attack on the airfield at Srinagar, one which had come under frequent attack by the PAF. At the time, Flying Officer Sikon, callsign Brother, and his section leader Flight Lieutenant Guman, whose callsign was G-Man, were on standby in operational readiness awaiting scramble order. Guman and Sikon took off to confront the incoming aircraft as 2 of the Sabres came in and dropped their bombs on the runway, while the other 2 Sabres were providing top cover ready to engage any Indian interceptors. Guman climbed to try and get above the Sabres, but Sikon, fully aware that the odds were against him, nevertheless engaged 2 enemy Sabres that had flown over him as he took off. In a fierce dogfight, he was heard saying over the radio, "I have these 2 bastards ahead of me, I will not let them go." In the melee that followed, which descended to treetop level, he managed to damage 2 Sabres, setting one ablaze, although some sources state that Sikon managed to down one of the enemy fighters. Sikon's determined attack caused the remaining Pakistani aircraft to disengage, turn tail and flee for home base. Now battered by enemy fire, his aircraft was ordered back to base, but Sikon was last seen holding a steady level course. His last transmission was, "I think I'm hit." Tragically, as he struggled to maintain control, his canopy broke away, maybe in an attempt to eject. The damaged Gnat, likely crippled by control system failure, rolled inverted and plunged into a gorge, claiming his life. Although the wreckage was later discovered, his body was never recovered. He was awarded the Param Veer Chakra posthumously, India's highest gallantry award. It took 4 enemy pilots to bring down his one valiant Sikh. During the limited air war, the Indian Air Force flew nearly 6,000 sorties and lost between 45 and 65 aircraft, while the Pakistani Air Force flew almost 3,000 and lost around 75, if the current figures are to be trusted. To this day, the Sabre Slayer moniker still rankles the Pakistani Air Force, but because the Gnats engaged with the enemy only a few dozen times or so across the 2 wars, it would be difficult to declare one aircraft superior to the other. However, it is undeniable that the Gnat's contribution was significant in those few engagements. So significant that the Indians decided to build upon their success. Despite the Gnat having a number of unresolved issues like the unreliable guns and hydraulics, not to mention her short legs, the Indian Air Force was pleased with the little fighter and saw in her a machine on which they could build. By the end of the 2 Indo-Pakistan wars, Hindustan Aircraft had built 195 Gnat F1s, and despite the positive attitude towards the type, the war brought home to the Air Force that they needed a better Gnat. Therefore, the IAF issued a requirement for an upgraded and more capable air defense variant of the Gnat, and later they added ground attack capabilities to the wish list. The new aircraft would address the shortcomings in maintainability because having such a small frame, everything was so tightly packed in, along with fixing those hydraulic issues that had plagued the original Gnats. Plus, they'd include upgrades like a better Martin Baker 00 ejection seat instead of the Folland design seat, new avionics, upgraded landing gear, and fuel tanks built into the wings. Now, instead of trying to build a brand new Gnat from scratch, Hindustan Aeronautics, which had acquired the residual rights to jigs and the test apparatus from Folland Aircraft, when the company went into liquidation during the 1960s, took the final pair of airframes from their production line and modified them to be used as the initial prototypes. Now renamed the Ajeet, meaning invincible or unconquerable, first flew on March 6, 1975, with the first production aircraft flying on 30th of September 1976. Externally, the Ajeet looked very similar to the Gnat F1 at a casual glance, except having 4 underwing hardpoints instead of the Gnat's 2 and an all-moving slab tailplane. Due to the increased internal 250-litre fuel capacity of its wet wing, the Ajeet no longer had to carry external drop tanks, and because of this, the Ajeet with its 4 pylons could carry 2,000 pounds of external stores like the Matra rocket pods or 500-pound iron bombs. Now it was better suited than the original Gnat to the ground attack role, along with its 30mm Aiden cannon and Ferranti gun sight to improve its gunfighting accuracy. Powered with the HAL Bristol Orpheus 70101 turbojet engine, producing 4,800 pounds of thrust, the Ajeet had a top speed of around 700 miles an hour at sea level and could also, like the Gnat, exceed Mach 1 in a shallow dive. The party trick of the Ajeet was its climb rate. In a clean configuration, it could ascend at an initial 20,000 feet per minute, with a time to 40,000 feet of just 5 minutes. Unlike the RAF, which had the 2-seat trainer, the Indian Air Force had no such luxury, with Indian pilots relying on some dual instruction on the Hawker Hunter before going solo on the Gnat. To correct this oversight, it was decided to build a 2-seat trainer version of the Ajeet, which was easier said than done. The little aircraft, already bursting at the seams, needed to be rejigged. Therefore, the fuselage was extended by 1.4 meters, removing the 2 internal fuel tanks to fit the second cockpit. Surprisingly, the stores pylons and the pair of 30mm cannons could have been removed to increase fuel capacity. However, should the need arise, the cannons could be taken out and replaced with additional fuel tanks. Some sources claim that only 2 prototypes were built, both powered by the same Orpheus engine, which, because of the increased weight, made the trainer underpowered and sluggish to handle. Of the 2 prototypes, one was lost in a crash in 1982, and the same sources state that the trainer was never put into production, whereas some claim that up to 30 were built and even entered squadron service. According to the website Bahat Rashak, the author states that at least one production aircraft, serial E2427, was delivered to No. 18 Squadron, with which he undertook training flights, providing his logbook entries as proof. But ultimately, the whole project was dropped, with the IAF opting for the BAE Hawk to fill the advanced trainer role. And by the time the Ajeet entered service in No. 2 Squadron in 1977, the only one to have taken the little aircraft, the IAF enthusiasm towards the fighter had cooled, with their priorities now shifting towards supersonic fighters. When manufacture finally ended in 1982, a total of 79 Ajeets had been built, with an additional 10 Gnats upgraded to the Ajeet standards. Still, the Ajeets were never used in combat operations, having short, uneventful lives, and so in 1991, both the Gnat and the Ajeet were withdrawn from Indian Air Force squadrons after almost 30 years of service. The nimble aerobatic qualities of the Gnat didn't go unnoticed by the RAF. In fact, it was these very qualities which led to its adaptation as the aircraft of choice for the Royal Air Force's aerobatic demonstration teams. By late 1962, the Gnat had entered service with the Central Flying School and began replacing the Asian Vampire trainers at No. 4 Flying Training School, based at RAF Valley, where they were organised into 2 squadrons, each with 2 flights. It didn't take long for someone to spot the aircraft's potential for formation flying, and therefore in 1964 an aerobatic team was formed under the leadership of Flight Lieutenant Lee Jones. 5 Gnats were given a distinctive all-yellow paint job, with the team adopting the name Yellowjacks, a nod to Jones's call sign. The Yellowjacks had a busy season in 1965, performing displays across the UK and mainland Europe, but despite the success, the RAF wanted something more official. Jones was tasked with establishing a more formal aerobatic team under the RAF banner. This led to the creation of the Red Arrows, with an all-red colour scheme and later Royal Air Force titles painted along the fuselage. The Reds would become one of the most recognisable display teams in the world. Their first performance for the media was at Little Rissington, though only the flat display could be flown due to poor weather. Their public debut came shortly after on 15th of May 1965 at the Biggin Hill Air Fair, and it wasn't until July the following year that 9 Gnats flew together for the first time at a display. One bit of lore from the Gnat display team days involves something called Fuse 13. This component was installed in the aircraft to limit the roll rate, intended to prevent structural damage from overly enthusiastic aileron rolls. Of course, when you're flying air shows, limits are suggestions at best. With the fuse quietly removed, pilots could perform the dazzling twinkle roll. That lasted until 1972, when Command officially stepped in and reinstalled the fuse. Technically, they didn't say it had to be a working fuse, so the rolls continued, until one aircraft suffered structural failure. After that, fully functional fuses were returned and the twinkle roll was silently retired. The Red Arrows flew the Gnat through the 1979 display season after they were swapped over to the BAE Hawk for the 1980 shows. What is saddest about the Gnat's final achievement is that William Petter probably never even knew about it. By then, he had lost all interest in aircraft and had become a recluse. The takeover of Folland by Hawker Siddeley had been brutal on him. Over the years, he would often take time off, seeking solace in a religious commune. But as the health of his beloved wife Claude declined, Petter withdrew from the world completely. In May 1968, William Teddy Petter died. He was a complex man, as most brilliant men are, and he was most definitely a man of his time. While the RAF never purchased the Gnat as a frontline fighter, the aircraft did find success abroad. 3 countries, including India, ended up operating it, each with varying degrees of involvement. Yugoslavia received 2 single-seat Gnats in mid-1958 for evaluation. Unfortunately, one was written off after a belly landing caused by hydraulic failure. The other aircraft, serial number 11601, was preserved and eventually ended up in the Aeronautical Museum in Belgrade, Serbia. Despite the initial interest, Yugoslavia opted not to adopt the Gnat, and instead they chose its old nemesis, the F-86, and then they went on to develop their own successful family of trainers and light attack aircraft. Due to post-war restrictions imposed by the 1947 Paris Peace Treaty and its former alignment with the Soviet Union, Finland was limited in the number of modern fighter aircraft it could acquire. However, there was a loophole. They could sidestep these restrictions by buying the Gnat since it was technically a trainer. Finland's first 2 aircraft were delivered on the 30th of July 1958 and continued until 1960, serial GN101 through GN113. 2 were modified for photo reconnaissance with flat noses and camera bays that held 3 70mm Vin10 cameras and designated as Gnat FR1s. The Gnat showed promise, and Major Lauri Pikuri even broke the sound barrier in one of the first aircraft shortly after delivery. But technical problems started to appear early on. One aircraft, GN102, crashed on the 26th of August 1958 due to a mechanical fault. That grounded the fleet until the issue was found and fixed. Although the aircraft returned to service by early 1959, confidence in the Gnat had taken a hit, and talk of expanding the fleet or setting up licensed production quickly faded away. And the troubles didn't stop there. The Finnish Gnats continued to suffer from persistent reliability issues, mostly hydraulic problems, which limited their flying hours. They underwent constant modifications to improve performance and safety, and by 1967 the Gnat had been pushed out of frontline service by the arrival of the Soviet MiG-21s and Saab Drakons. After that, the Gnat was used only in training until finally retired in 1974. It seems that despite the Gnat's successes in India, European customers were dissatisfied and didn't order any more. In closing, there are still many Gnats in private ownership around the world, and if you're lucky enough to get a ride in one, I truly envy you. Check out the YouTube channel Jet Jared, where he has a beautiful T1. His channel is linked in the description. And that's the Gnat's tale. Thanks to men like William Petter, Stanley Hooker, and Nirmaljit Singh Sikon, the Gnat will always be a legend in my book. Proof that size doesn't matter when you've got heart. And no doubt there are still many RAF and IAF pilots around who would agree. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the subscribe button and turn on that notification bell. I've got some great videos coming out soon and I wouldn't want you to miss them. Now put the kettle on, make another brew, grab some more digestives, and cheers to the little jet and the men who made her possible.